Well, Michael, very excited for you to be here and
Thanks,
to have
Sam.
this conversation. Um, so, when I go online and I read, you know, stuff from many different people, there are a few who I think talk of nature and how we are related to it and our place in the world with a degree of scientific rigor, but also poesy than you. Um, if poesy is a word, maybe it's just poetic. Anyway,
Yes, yes, yes.
um, and I'm really curious about how this, like, how you came to be in a way, because I think you've got such a talent for bringing science and the, I guess, for lack of a better term, the religious experience or the religiosity that is associated with being and the interconnectedness with us in the world. So I understand that you began, I guess, as a paleontologist at the age of 2.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think if we're going to take it a little further, I am, my brother and I are frequently comment on the fact that our parents who split up when I was 13, uh, in many ways seem like they should never have been together. And so I feel like there was they're both wonderful people, and now happily remarried, but it's just such a strange thing that they were together for 17 years given their apparent incompatibility. And so I think that there is something in my life, a kind of a deep current in my mythology that is about the reconciliation of impossible opposites. So I think that that kind of speaks to your science and religion thing, that it's like, on one hand, obviously my parents love each other, still loved each other very much, and on the other hand, if I were to look up, for example, to tip my hand and demonstrate my woo right out of the gate here, if you look up the secret language of relationships, which is this very bizarre effort at a kind of garage empiricism that I want to say, was it Gary Schneider and Don Joost? I forget the two authors, but they're like long-term practicing therapists and astrologers, one or both of them, and they did this kind of survey of 20 years of practice and like thousands and thousands of relationships, people that have come into their relationship practice, and extracted from this correlations with the weeks that people were born. And anyway, it says about my parents, like, it was like Winston Churchill and Hitler were the historical examples of like people born on these 2 weeks. Like, they cannot help but go head to head. And so, at any rate, yeah, I was, one of my parents was Presbyterian and the other was Jewish. And neither of, one was practicing and one really wasn't. One is extremely good with money, and one is just a complete romantic, with no money sense whatsoever. And I think that there was, so I feel within myself the project of the synthesis of seemingly irreconcilable perspectives, and that very much that's become more and more obvious in my adulthood. And so, so yeah, I grew up with a real sense of wonder and imagination, and actually was in Australia when I was 4, because at the time my father worked for a cruise line. And I remember being in Australia and having this like vivid sense that I am walking in the footsteps of dinosaurs, and that like it felt like Australia is such a vibrant biodiverse place, and I remember feeling like I was just around the corner from living dinosaurs,
Yeah,
and it was so at any
1000%
rate,
was.
that's, yeah, I think that there's, I don't know, I guess the dinosaur thing came out of, as near as I can figure, a fascination with the very large, loud, and scary. Like a lot of kids are also into, and as I was also into construction equipment, like earth movers and that kind of stuff. And I remember when I met my childhood role model, Robert Bacher, who was kind of a celebrity dinosaur hunter, wrote Dinosaur Heresies, was responsible for getting dinosaurs walking upright in the public imagination, feathered, warm-blooded, caring for their young. played a huge role in that. He I met him at the Palm Springs Museum of the Desert in Southern California at the age of 3 when my family was there on a business trip. And at the same time, he was part of this larger exhibit with the Dynamation animatronic dinosaurs. So they were touring the United States with these life-size robotic replicas of dinosaurs that were making all of these very loud, scary noises. And I was already into dinosaurs at the time, but that really sealed it for me. Was this sense of being like a child, just a magical encounter. Before one really learns to differentiate between, what adults would consider fictional and non-fictional, or real and simulacrum. And so that was the weekend that really sealed it for me. And Robert Bacher has always been a profound enthusiast of child science and really, really encouraged me to go deeper with my study. And then years later, met me and my mother in his hometown of Boulder, Colorado, for like a 4-hour lunch, and just treated me to like answering all of my questions about the science of Jurassic Park, which is a film on which he was a principal consultant, and drew me. He was an amazing he still is an amazing anatomical illustrator who taught anatomy at Johns Hopkins and also taught the Talmud in its original Hebrew. And so he himself is one of these people that is a lifetime sober, world-class researcher who also happened to be deeply ensconced in religious scholarship for whatever reason. And when I would later on in my teen years, when I was working with him in Wyoming, in Como Bluff, which is this legendary site for dinosaur fossil research, where Stegosaurus was discovered back in, I think, the 1870s and so on. I remember him incessantly quoting Beavis and Butthead and show tunes, and just completely, a cultural and scientific gourmand who just devoured and regurgitated everything from all different quadrants, and really, really instilled in me a sense of what it is to be a Renaissance man or Renaissance person. Gave these extraordinarily captivating talks where he would stand up in front of an audience with this sheet of butcher paper and draw everything he was talking about on the spot. And, I think that really changed the way that I thought about education and the way that I thought about public performance, influenced my later work as a painter on site at festivals, and working in front of people, creating stuff in front of people as they watch. So at any rate, he and I haven't spoken to him in years. He's very difficult to get a hold of, and kind of reclusive, and I think he and I had kind of a tragic falling out in my early 20s. But I still have the highest respect for him as someone who has encouraged countless young minds into the process, and into the sort of initiation into this kind of desert mysticism. That I really found myself in a kind of a mosaic exodus kind of a sense, more at home out in the Badlands of Wyoming than I felt at home in Orlando and then later Kansas City for the other 51 weeks a year as a teenager. Like, I became kind of a wild animal under his tutelage. And so that's where it came in. It's like paleontology rushed into my mind and heart, along with all of these other things, along with this sense of the sacredness of the living world, and this sense of the power of communication to inspire and to enlighten people, and the sense that you can have a conversation in which you're quoting the Bible and Beavis and Butthead and like anatomical textbooks in the same sentence. It's just like, that's where I come from. That's the soil I grew up in.
I love it.
So yeah,
I love it. That's I think more science communicators should I guess, engage with others with, such a repertoire, but also just to, what am I trying to say here? To not be so stifling and boring, but like to really bring in the like all the cultural tools that we have available to just make shit interesting. I think you do a great job of that in your podcast. So I'm very
Thanks.
curious about how, like, so you had this deep fascination with paleontology, and which I could just say science writ large. When, like, were you always an artist, or when? How did art become a big part of your life?
I mean, I was drawing before I met Bob Barker. I was, my mom tells me that, some of the stuff I was doing at age 2, like, was like a recognizable stegosaurus, or that I would draw mountains that looked to her like the mountains, not of our hometown outside of Los Angeles at the time, but of like ancient Chinese classical paintings. And so I don't know. I was very observant. I carried around a sketchbook with me always as a child. I was very lucky to have really excellent public schooling in Orlando, in a state which otherwise had really poor education. But I had just an extraordinary teacher, Annetta Igu, for 3 consecutive years in grade school. And so I was with the same class of students and the same teacher. And she was another person who really encouraged a sort of ecumenical approach to learning, an
But what does
integrated.
ecumenical mean?
Oh, ecumenical in like a religious sense of just like all, embracing everything, like seeing it all as sort of one,
Hmm.
one mountain that
Okay.
we're all climbing together.
Yeah.
And so,
That's
that's the
powerful.
way, yeah.
Like,
So she
considering
taught.
like the way most people think of the world, and I try to understand it, they break it down into these little compartments, and then they investigate those little bounded circles, and then
I mean,
that's
you
about
have
it.
to. Yeah, you
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to.
it's
Like
necessary.
it's, she taught us Greek and Latin root words in the 2nd grade. She integrated the subjects in a way that I remember Bob Barker ranting about the importance of in the field later on when I was with him. That they both of them really felt that it was important to teach this sort of um, holistic, uh, integral, unified vision, to see with whole eyes. And of course, like in order to do that, you have to, like you just said, you have to learn all of these things. You have to, zoom in and observe these things with detail. But like part of that structure of education, part of that learning process is to constantly zoom in and back out, and like never lose sight of the forest for the trees or the trees for the forest. And so I was very lucky to have that, in a life that has otherwise been, very sort of discontinuous. I've moved around a lot. It's, I've suffered a lot of, relational and economic traumas, but I'm lucky to have had, a very whole and continuous education as a small child. Actually, my Annetta Igu, I met her even before I was in the 2nd grade because she was hosting a summer educational program, running an archaeological expedition in her own backyard in Orlando, where she had me and a bunch of other kids digging up a bunch of stuff that she had buried in her yard. And so it was like a way of teaching us about, history and art. And her house is like a cabinet of curiosities, like the most bizarre, stuffed creatures and like parlor tools, like this little thing you like electrocute yourself with that was like a parlor toy from the 19th century, and like amazing art from all over the world. She went with her husband, her now husband, to Morocco for their honeymoon when they were married after my 2nd grade year, and brought us back all of these Moroccan coins and just like really inspired this sort of, this questing global inquiry, and we were doing at any rate. So the art thing comes. I think the art was really encouraged. My house, I always had art supplies around. My mom was made very sure of that. And then as school got more and more boring and routine and kind of industrial, as I went into middle school and high school, then the art buoyed me through it, and I was always taking notes and drawing at the same time, and never considered that I would become a professional artist in any way. Never thought that. Always thought I was going to be an academic, that I would come out of this with a PhD and a class of paleontology undergrads that I'm leading into the field every summer. But I continued to doodle dinosaurs and biomechanical xenomorphs and anything. Like, I love like detailed stuff, fine pen work, and that really got me through hundreds of hours of immense, boring, just just awful classes. Uh, as well as, I should add, something I figured out in college. I hated my second chemistry semester. I hated the teacher. I found it just it was an enormous classroom, like 900 people or something insane at the University of Kansas. And this guy thought he was the funniest thing, but he was just awful. And I remember looking at this guy sitting in the front row of that course, just pounding away at his laptop, rapt, just amazed, totally captivated by this professor. And I realized this was a really important lesson. I realized that something about this course made it this guy's favorite course. And so that it was like my opinion of this professor and this material was my opinion. It was not like an objective reality, and that there was some way that I could method act my way into giving a damn about chemistry too. And that like all I had to know was that there was one person who really, really cared about it, and then try and get into their head. And that's its own form of art. And in a way that, like, transcending the medium through which I create, I think that getting people into other people's heads is, maybe the most artistic thing, or like perhaps even the fundamental purpose of art itself. That there's something about art as a communication of a state of consciousness. And so, this process and of being able to take the perspectives of other people is, I think, the rail that all of us are on in terms of developmental psychology. It's like a measure of how wise you are is like how well you are capable of getting out of your own head and into someone else's head, and then getting back, and then like understanding the relationship between those perspectives, I think, is really, really key. And I think that that's like, again, I think that that's in some way the primordial art form that transcends the means of all of its manifestations.
That I think that point is a good springboard to kind of talk about the times in which we're living in, and how it seems, at least for so many, perhaps myself included, that it can just be so like next to impossible to really get in the heads of those people that we see on the other side of our looking glasses, our smartphones, and to really see what is driving them to say such things. How do they see the world? And then reconciling that there's the plurality of viewpoints and making some productive use of them. Like we are in your I think in your piece on the coronavirus, you write that we're in an epistemic crisis, and I think we've been in one for a while. It's just that the coronavirus has really made it abundantly clear, and that it's not just the layman who may be right or wrong, but it's those that are by institutions described as experts, those that really should be the ones who are saying this is right and this is wrong. And we, the emperor is obviously wearing no clothes, because we can just see that what they're saying is nonsense. Like the WHO saying like you should not wear masks, for instance. And you're right that expertise is who and how and the pandemic makes this obvious. So perhaps you can just talk about what you were kind of saying there, and this. What's your take on the epistemic crisis? And maybe we can come to a way out of it. But just describe the situation that we're in from your perspective, because I'm really curious to hear about it.
Yeah, well, somebody that I have followed and read a lot of, and listened to all of his available lectures online, and was lucky enough to have I've interviewed actually 3 times over the years, twice before I started Future Fossils, and then once on Future Fossils podcast, is the historian, poet, and mythographer William Irwin Thompson, who left his position at MIT in the 70s. He called himself an atheist at the Vatican because like some of his earliest writings were extremely critical of this technocratic, elitist, globalist approach that was developed there, and espoused elsewhere at like the Club of Rome and some of these places, and really, really has shaped the world that we live in today. A sense of being able to use a systems view for social and ecological engineering is far, far from what I would call a humble approach to the mystery of our reality. And so he left and he started this transdisciplinary think tank for the immanentization of planetary culture called the Lindisfarne Association. And I'll send you a link to the collected Lindisfarne tapes, which are up on the E.F. Schumacher Center for New Economics website, which I binged while on tour, on festival tour across the U.S. in 2013. That was just like all I listened to all summer. And in those tapes, he talks about how we are moving out of, he looks at like major world ages in the history of civilization. And he says, actually, right now we're moving out of this, the kind of Newtonian worldview and into a chaos and complexity worldview, what he called a chaotic dynamical world age that's defined less by the trade of ideas through maritime commerce and more through the trade of identities in a world wed to itself through electronic communication. And so he saw in the 1970s and a coming age of increasing, he's very early to the tip as far as
70s prescient.
That was around the same time that The Limits to Growth came out, I think 1972, and he was writing some of his early work At the Edge of History in I think came out in 73, so like very much stewing in the same worldview where he was talking to, some of these people like Lynn Margulis, who was the biologist that changed our understanding of evolution, the modern complex cell being a symbiotic collaboration between different bacteria. He was working with Stewart Kaufman, who was at the Santa Fe Institute and worked on self-organization and the origins of life. He was working with Paolo Soleri, the visionary architect who studied under Frank Lloyd Wright and then went on to build Arcosanti, which was this sort of visionary project in Arizona that was a sort of post-car, atavistic in a way reclamation of the human scale. And so anyway, this is the point, is that he was working with all of these people who were looking at history and evolution and natural history through this multi-scale lens. That was actually around, I think, the same time Power of 10 came out in 1974, that film that zooms in and out from the subatomic level out to the size of the whole universe and then back. And so this kind of thinking around, also Stewart Brand was a part of this organization. Stewart who founded Long Now, the Long Now Foundation, which I'm also affiliated with out of some amazing serendipity. Stewart was the guy who wrote the petition to the United States government to get the first images of Earth from space declassified, because he believed that being able to look at the entire blue marble of our planet would be a transformative event for humans, would be the image, the dominant symbol of the 20th century, the most profound and transformative thing. And he was right. We're looking at a movement, part of this, my friends who are like scholars of indigenous wisdom, like my friend Violet Luxton in California, talks about the difference between the sort of Western mental approach and the indigenous approach, in which we think of time in a kind of like linear way in the West, and then time and the cosmos are understood as, contained within like the medicine wheel, the sacred hoop, by most indigenous peoples. And so, at any rate, that's kind of a tangent. But the point is that Bill Thompson and a lot of these people that he was thinking with were thinking about the scale at which we exist. And one of the things that has happened is that the modern era and the first two industrial revolutions really moved us out of a human scale world, a world where we're surrounded by things that, are kind of like we evolved to be surrounded by, farm animals, this kind of thing, living in villages of, Dunbar number or sub Dunbar number people. We can remember all the people that we see on a regular basis. We have relationships, intimate relationships with them. And the shift to urban life, and urban life as dependent on these massive systems that we cannot see, basically, what Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects, like the electrical grid, which we can't perceive it all at once. We can only catch like flickers, intimations of it, the way that like a cell can only sort of, intuit the body that it lives within. We've moved out of this age where things make sense to your average human being, and into an age where it's almost better that we characterize the postmodern world, what Bill Thompson called the meta-industrial civilization, as one that is navigated more like the pre-modern demon-haunted world that Carl Sagan was writing about. Where it's beyond our ability to actually effectively wield the tools of rationality that we developed over the last 400 years to address things, because it's not a Newtonian system. It's not linear and orderly, and cause and effect don't work in this like, intuitive way. It's like there's all these second, third, fourth order consequences. There's like, all of these things that, how many degrees out can you think about all of the factors that have caused a situation, and so like our brains have largely been tuned to develop easy narratives, to assign kind of local, personified blame or like a responsibility. We look for charismatic leaders. We want to put our faith in the president, even when we shouldn't, and not just the president, but, people, leaders. Yeah. Someone. We want someone to hold our hand through the insanity, the turbulence, the chaos and metamorphosis that we're living through. And it's just not appropriate anymore. And so we're at a really difficult moment, because these kind of things can be taught, this kind of learning. It's like writing, it's like you can learn to write as an adult. It's just harder. And the kids that are growing up now as digital natives are going to have a much easier time navigating the complexities of the world that we live in, but they will still be subject to the same cognitive and attentional biases that we suffer from, because those things are kind of baked into us evolutionarily, by which I mean, we tend to develop what SFI external professor Mazarin Banaji has called implicit biases, basically like stereotypes that we don't realize that we're carrying around and acting on, because it's easier for us to not treat every single situation we encounter as a novel situation, to have to like treat it as unique. And so we develop these rules about the world, and mostly we don't even realize that we've done this. And even those of us who think, oh, I'm a very, fair humanist kind of person, I'm not a racist. Well, the psychological evidence suggests that you don't actually have any control over this, because if you're exposed to racist stereotypes, they still affect the way that you are subconsciously processing information. Say, you run into someone in a dark alley, or you're engaging with someone on social media only, with only their profile picture to go off of. And like, especially in time compressed encounters where you don't have a lot of time to like sit down and break bread with somebody and get to know them, we rely more and more on our stereotypes, on our shorthands. And so the faster the world asks us to run in order to keep pace with things, the more likely we are to treat one another unfairly, simply because, we're not taking the time. And then also, the same is true. I go into much more detail about this in a podcast I recorded with comedian Shane Moss, who has this amazing show called Here We Are. We had a conversation called Science versus Human Nature, where we like went into detail about all these biases. But like one of them is that we have like a local information gathering bias, where it's better, like generally speaking, it's more important that we are in alignment with the friends and coworkers and family members upon whom we socially depend than it is that we're in alignment with whatever objective reality is. I mean, there are obviously plenty of counterexamples, but like when it comes to political elections, SFI professor Mirta Galasic, with whom I had a great conversation on Complexity podcast, some of her work looked at how you actually get, and this is to your point about like expertise is who you know, and like what kind of history you've had and so on, that she found that you can poll people and ask them who they're going to vote for in an election, but the results that you're going to get are less accurate than if you ask them who they think their friends are going to vote for. Because ultimately on the day before the election, a lot of people flip the script because they realize that they would rather not argue for the next 4 years with everyone they know, and that it's just easier to like toe the line and vote the way you think all your friends and family are going to vote. And that this kind of thinking is going on all the time. So like people, another piece of research that she did was on how people of privilege tend to believe that everyone in the world has the same privilege because those are the people they're hanging out with, and then they're projecting that local reality onto everybody else. And so this is not actually just about financial privilege. Like if you're happily married, you assume that more people are happily married than actually are. And it's equally true in the opposite direction. It's equally true that if life is just shitting on you, then you're going to think that that more people are suffering in the way that you are suffering. And you see this all the time with people that are like, this is like a suicide hotline thing, right? Like that you're having a hard life, so you just assume that the world is horrible. You don't trust other people's happiness. You don't see it as an invitation into a separate state of consciousness. And so there's this thing about, well, the fact is, because of the mathematics of any kind of privilege, if you're actually you're equally biased but more likely to be right statistically if you assume that other people are suffering in the way that you suffer. But but it's just one of these things where it's like, we basically are looking for all of these shorthands. We project our reality onto everyone else's reality, and we have, because of the media ecosystem in which we live, we have been funneled into an even narrower field of attention than we're capable of, and even more reactive and inflammatory discourse than we're capable of. And so, we are in a really tough spot where we have to work against the entropic currents that, of our sort of technosphere and its wants, and the institutional agencies that we're sort of embedded in, and say like, no, I'm taking a stand, like Doug Rushkoff with his Team Human podcasts. He's like, no, I'm not going to do what Google wants me to do. Like the people inside Google don't even want Google to do what Google wants them to do. I mean, I am lucky enough to know a ton of people inside Google, and they're all great people. None of them are like, ha ha ha, like you will be assimilated. They're all trying to turn this ship around from the inside, which is extraordinary hard work. And that's that's the work that we're being called to do right now, I think, is to say, look, the economies of scale that have favored efficiency and convenience over the last 300 years have hollowed out all of the messy, creative possibility that makes being a human not only rich and wonderful and rewarding, but also robust and anti-fragile to the kinds of changes that we're facing as a society. We absolutely need to restore this mesocosmic layer, the layer of like neighborhoods and worship groups and like book clubs and all of the things that the coronavirus has attacked. It's like it's forcing us to sever from the vestigial human communities that we've been keeping, to realize that they have been withered to a vestige, and that it's time to start nourishing that stuff actively again, because we need to recenter things a little bit. The centrifuge of history has gotten us focused on global and like microscopic, and we need to bring back this human scale. So that's really I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question. I think I answered like five other questions.
No, but it's great.
But,
it's great.
And rant.
That point about how the coronavirus has taken away from us something that's so vital, not only to our well-being, but also vital to our those things coming together in groups and conversing and sharing experiences and just coming together is necessary for us to tackle the array of challenges which we currently face. Like if we wish to change course and take our foot off the accelerator and do all these sorts of things to really bring about these titanic shifts which are necessary, we actually need to come together in person. We need to have these communal groups. I'm not just talking about mass protests. Like the change happens a lot lower. Like the protests are the manifestation of lots of underlying interactions which we have been stripped of. And the only ways in which right now many of us can actually interact are through these digital mediums, which are so low bandwidth, like compared to the what you get from when you actually speak to someone in person and you feel that connection, that ineffable connection. Like you can't quite get, I think, through this, but when you're in a group of people and you're all kind of talking about something that's important, there's this thing in the air, which has been taken from us. And that's what we need to tap into in order for us to kind of to shift the boat, to chart a new course. And it's this thing I've been struggling with, because I know that we need to kind of move towards this, where we need to bring community back. Like we need, like you said, we need these local interactions. We need the church services on a Sunday, but maybe with a bit of science thrown in. We don't need like the gospel. We need I don't know, insert Carl Sagan here or something. We need some cosmically, scientifically aligned, I would say, religion and communal practice to kind of shift us in that direction. And one of the great things about the coronavirus is it's making us realize that, holy shit, we need to adapt. But the nature of the virus, what it's done to our systems and pulling us apart, is making that all the more difficult. So it's like a wake-up call. But if we don't get our hands on it, if we don't right this ship, then we are in a bit of trouble.
Oh yeah, we're in trouble. There's no question. One way or the other.
We were in trouble 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but now we're in extra.
Right. I mean, I do kind of hope. I think the beacon of hope that I see in this situation is kind of gallows humor, kind of dark, bright thing. You gotta. I really value being able to hold the paradox here, which is that I think that in a way, there's hope in the fact that it's getting so bad that it's becoming more and more obvious to the people that have been failed by our systems of education and have never really learned to take a systems level view of things, and are only capable of appreciating the fact that I guess coronavirus is real because my dad got it, or, I guess climate change is real because my city is on fire.
The sky is red.
Right.
It's like,
and even now, it's like I'm watching people on Twitter go, leftist arsons started the fires on the West Coast to get us to believe in climate change. And it's like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Like a bunch of, woodland conservationists decided to burn down their temple in order to get you to fund what at that point? Like, what would you be saving?
And even if that was the case, I saw this tweet from, I think it was Joe Norman, and it's like sometimes, a good heuristic is to focus on the fuel, not the spark, right? Doesn't matter even if that was the case, the fact that the fuel that could, fuel this conflagration that's, enveloping, half a continent is worth paying attention to.
Yeah. And so, to your point, I was really lucky yesterday. I spoke with Caveat Magister, who is the sort of resident philosopher of Burning Man. And I was talking with him and two other friends of mine, Naomi Most and Mitch Mignano, both of whom are, all three of them have, done a lot more work on either the scholarship of Burning Man, and like Mitch was a student in the grad school of William Irwin Thompson's and looked at the way that festivals like Burning Man are, participating in the emergence of this new planetary culture. And Naomi is an organizer at the Noise Bridge Hackerspace in San Francisco and kind of like an anarchist community leader. And so like the three of them and I were talking yesterday about how we feel the transition into virtual reality went for Burning Man this year. And also, how that is sort of juxtaposed against the number of, tiny local events where, people still burned an effigy in their homes or, like had some friends over for a little social distancing in-person, gathering. And, what it is that we are still learning about the digital space, like how to embody ourselves in that space. And but I guess the thing that I want to, point to in that conversation was all of us agreed that the age of this sort of globalist rhetoric that the internet is going to bring everybody together is like behind us. And, that there are now multiple webs, very few, none of them are really worldwide. Russia has its own internet. China has its own internet. The rest of the world kind of doesn't want to be a part of those internets, and they don't want to be a part of ours. And, and it's like, so there's a sense in which, systems in crisis, like the Chacoan people of New Mexico, the antiquity, or, the Balkans, the fact that we have a word for this, balkanization, that a system in crisis tends to break apart so that it can sense make in a time scale that actually meets the demands of the eruptive novelty that it's suffering through. So like we can actually, I was talking about this with the president of the Santa Fe Institute on episode 29 of Complexity Podcast, where he was referencing the work of Miguel Fuentes, who has done work on network structure through social revolutions, and found that you can actually kind of call a revolution by looking at the way that communication structures start to break up in anticipation of that revolution. And so we are actually witnessing this right now. Like it's very clear that the next decade is going to be a year of massive and epochal political change, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And the evidence of this is not just what we would call like polarization per se, but this move back to smaller communities of sense making, a fragmentation of the social graph. But in practice, what that looks like, and what, Caveat Magister was saying about it, was that this means that, for better or worse, this is the first year that we did not have thousands of people gathered around one man in the center of Black Rock City in Nevada. What we had was, lots, like thousands of gatherings of like 1 to a dozen people all over the world. And like probably more people were engaged in this ritual on this evening than ever have been before. But it had just like the pine cone had burned and like erupted and thrown its seeds everywhere, Like that's the seed had burst and like shot all of its stuff to the wind, and so there's this sense that like this is the time of a kind of diaspora that is going to lead to like all of these individual campfires where people are locally making sense of things. And for example, I witnessed the exodus from Facebook to like Discord servers. This is a big thing for Future Fossils. Was me reallocating my attention from the Future Fossils Facebook group, which is still fine. It's humming along, but to this invite only Discord server where people could establish much more intimate and profound interpersonal relationships without just sort of pissing into the wind. Like this is why, last point I would make about this is why I think the evidence points to a hot springs origin of life model rather than an oceanic origins of life model. Because if you're looking at like the entire ocean, it's like impossible to imagine how molecules can like aggregate and form layers and like actually huddle up in such a powerful solvent that's just like the currents and everything, whereas like a little hot spring that dries out and gets periodically refilled with water and then kind of bakes layers of stuff into the sun. This like the incubator for life. You don't incubate a fetus on like the roof of a house during a windstorm. Like you put them inside a womb. And so like I think whatever is being born through us now has to be born through the wombs of all of these, like a massive parallel experiment that we're running. How many different, to use the Chinese expression, let 100 flowers bloom. Evolution is, if nothing else, entropic and endlessly creative in its relentless search of the space of all possibilities. And so like amidst this crisis, this is the solution, which is, huddle up, find your people, and then like find your own way, and then compare it to the ways that everyone else are doing it, and like, relentlessly steal the good ideas from each other. Yeah. And that's how we're going to get through.
I love in your I guess essay, but part of the book, The Future is a Place. You say that process of evolution, of testing out lots of different possibilities, basically experimentation, is technically conservative because it conserves life. It's allowing us or life to exist across time. At least that's what I picked up from it. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important to kind of differentiate the way that people have run with the term conservative, to mean sort of history blind at this point. When people talk about traditional marriage and they're looking at like the 150 years ago in one society, and it's like, that's like, if you're gonna come on, like if you're really gonna talk about traditional marriages, you got to talk about honor killings and like the stuff, like the stuff that was in the Bible, and like, do we really want to keep that? But on the other hand, like there is this sense of like the conservation of momentum, the way that structure is conserved. And I think that that's really what I was, getting at, which is that it's endless, that really when we're talking about something as broad and transcendent as the evolutionary process, then certain dualisms really just fail us. Like with the work of Lynn Margulis, when she's talking about symbiosis as a driving factor in major evolutionary transitions, in which the new level of individuality is some sort of meta-organism made through a collaboration, an intimate collaboration of the previous level of individuality. It's various, like what we're going through really right now as a species is, like brains linked by computers and this kind of thing. And where, what made us a species in the first place, the way that each of us is sort of nothing without other people. I mean, that's very bizarre in one sense, but also very characteristic of a winning strategy, evolutionarily speaking. That teams win uh, over the loner, and for many reasons. And so, like, when you're weighing that kind of transcendent, multi-perspectival object, then it doesn't make sense to talk about evolution as characterized only by collaboration or only by competition. And this is like another area where we just get hung up trying to oversimplify the story. And so again, like it doesn't make sense to talk about evolution as merely creative or merely conservative, because all of the creativity is based on the appropriation and repurposing of existing traits, perhaps in a new environment, but it's an enormous 4 billion year remix project that's just constantly building on its, remixing its prior remixes. And so that's, yeah, I mean, that's the point, is that if we really want to talk about this with sort of sufficient depth and dimensionality, that dimensionality is more than two. It's more than subject and object. And one of my favorite authors, Richard Doyle at Penn State University, who wrote Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere, starts that book by saying that he thinks that psychedelics are what he calls ecodelics, because he's very sensitive to the way that we talk about these things, and the sort of the way that the words that we use shape the algorithm of the experiences that these substances engender. He says that he believes that ecodelics are kind of training wheels for transhumanism, because by drawing us out of subject-object duality and into this sort of this n-dimensional hyperspace of transformed subjectivity, that they are preparing us to perceive and to navigate the world with the level of nuance and sophistication that will be required of us in this century. And so I love that, and I think that that's very accurate. So what is conserved when you go through a radical shift? Something is conserved, if you want to talk about it in that way, but maybe that's not where the focus necessarily should be anymore.
Yeah. I want to just dive back to I want to throw back to one of the things that you said about how the pine cone has exploded, or there are these campfires everywhere illuminating local contexts. And I think I love that metaphor, because the campfire, like we all, in order for us to really tackle the array of challenges we face, global challenges, we need to focus on our own local environments. And the move back to the local is one that we really need to accelerate, or that's the direction in which we need to go. However, what is also abundantly clear is that we need to align the local actions with the global needs, right? So I'm really curious, given your exposure to and your understanding of complexity science, and the difficulty in actually bringing about changes that you want when engaging with systems that are so incredibly complex. How do you think that we might be able to instill this sort of alignment between local needs and global needs? That's like the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, that really is, because I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about the conversation at the Santa Fe Institute, where I should make it clear, I'm not a researcher. I'm on the staff. I'm on the communications team, but I get to hang out with all of them.
Though, by saying that, I'll just say, like, you're an incredible communicator, and you get it. I mean, I don't know, I don't get it, but I think you get it, and you help me get it. So
I hope so. But one of the things that I'm starting to get is that the way that we have thought about complexity, or over the last 20 years, 30 years, as that term has come into its own in the sciences, is kind of wrong. That it's not about simple things coming together to make more and more complex things, that actually, Jessica Flack at SFI talks about this a lot. She talks about it in her community lecture, which is up on YouTube, which is, if you look at the complexity of one living cell, it's mind boggling, and that really, she's an information scientist. She looks at the ways that all of those cognitive biases I was talking about are ways for us to, quote unquote, coarse grain the world at the human level. So like we see the human realm as somehow less complex than an ecology, or than the ecology of stuff in your bloodstream, just because that's how our nervous systems are tuned. That we're chunking information in a particular way and processing that in a particular way. And, so I say that all as a disclaimer that we still, as much as the entire field of complex systems research has just totally flowered and matured over the course of our lifetimes, there's still this fundamental question, which is, how do you compare the complexity of what's going on in the microcosm to the complexity of what's going on in the macrocosm? Because the macrocosm doesn't actually see all of the detail and complexity of its constituent parts. Like, that's sort of the point. That's why these systems have to break apart when really rapid change is going down, because like, you don't actually have a God's eye view of everything going on inside your body, and you can't metabolically, it's impossible. And so, for the, like, I guess, that's one way of sort of leading up to this question of why it is that we have to rebel in some sense. I don't particularly like the word rebel, but like why it is that we have to assert our agency against the agency of the dehumanizing institutions in which we find ourselves embedded. Because your government on some important level, or your corporations that you depend on and for your modern life, are not aware of you in the way that you're not aware of the cells inside the tip of your finger, unless you burn them. And then even then, like, you probably didn't, you're just going to get more. And so like human beings are fungible to these systems. We're completely expendable and replaceable in an important way. I mean, there's arguments, but like for, the certain like special people, whatever. But, I think it's the case that like, when it comes to this question of like, at what scale should I be putting my attention? It's not, I mean, it's super still important to follow that bumper sticker that came out of the 1970s, right? Think globally, act locally. Because really, in some sense, that's all we can do. We're profoundly disempowered by the systems that, like the Matrix, basically. Like we're in a situation where, because of political lobbying, really only corporations get to decide who wins an election in a really horrifying way that Lawrence Lessig has spoken about extraordinary detail. Like, the number one thing we can do in politics right now is get money out of politics, because it's allowing these institutions with their own agency that is nobody's choice to drive the future of the entire system. And that needs to be, again, restored. That's the only way to restore democracy, is to restore the individual's ability to actually influence the system, to actually, your vote to actually count for something. And so to do work, there are people who are doing work on that level that, in some sort of mathematical sense, you might consider a local level, in that it's one, very narrow and specified project. Get money out of politics. And yet it's a project happening at the scale of the entire nation, right? And so, like, I don't know, like, I think that for most people do not have the means, do not have the affordances, do not have the network. The social network is, primary here in terms of, your ability to influence things based on who you know. And most people do not know enough people of influence to be able to work magic at that level, if you will. But most people know enough people in their neighborhood to make a difference at the scale of their neighborhood, and most people know enough about their backyard to be able to grow a beautiful garden in their backyard, and like you have that, or you can grow one on your roof if you live in the city, maybe, or like, it's I think it's not so much about uh the spatiotemporal scale so much as it is about the degree of separation that you are from various objects and processes in your networks. So like it's not about if you know everyone in Washington, then the United States is like a country club, and it's like it's actually a very small party in that respect, and like you can work things in that way that like most people, they're going to be going to like, parent teachers association meetings or something to have the same kind of impact. And so it's really just, I think that when it comes to like when I talk about thinking locally, there's a book by R.J. Stewart called The Way of Merlin. It's a book about practical magic. And I love this book. I mean, I may come out sounding pretty woo in recommending, like this kind of read. But like one of the things I loved about it was he talks about how all magic starts by finding a place of power, finding a sacred tree or a sacred stream, identifying, anchoring yourself in the landscape, anchoring yourself in where you are now, honoring the four directions and the above and the below and the within, so the seven directions, and centering your action, centering your agency in your own person. And that's how you start to reclaim your power from this world, which is profoundly orchestrated to decenter us, to get all of our attention on Netflix or on, CNN. And, it's like, I know so many people that are just in despair because they can't get their head out of the news. And it's like, I'm not saying don't watch the news. I'm saying you need to fix, you meaning all of us, I need to fix the balance between the attention that we're giving a world over which we have no control and our attention to a world over which we have some control. And, the only way that really what you can reach, what affordances are available to you is through a process of inquiry. I don't know if you can see this shirt. I got this shirt at the grocery store here in Santa Fe. That's the Zia, sort of the icon of Santa Fe. Inquire within, And so like that's, I love this shirt, and I love that.
So it's just for those listening, it's what's the Zia? Because
the Zia is a Native American symbol of like the four directions, and it's
like north, south, east, west, but there's like four fingers extending.
Right.
It's like the yin yang symbol with four fingers extending from each of the poles, or like the north, south, east, west areas.
Yeah. So it's the sacred wheel that's containing the play of opposites and so on, and so and then radiating out. And I think that's really that's what I wish to embody and what I wish to communicate, in an answer to that question, which is that you are of no use to this world. You are not helping anyone. You're not gonna help anyone if you don't first put on your own oxygen mask, right? Like if you don't first get clear about who you are and what you're connected to and what you know and what you don't know. And that's where you start, like there's no point in talking about the future of Earth with all of our attention on Mars. Like you can't, and in the same way, this country has spent so much time, attention, and resources trying to dominate the world, trying to manage the world, that we have eviscerated everything that made the United States great. We've allowed the infrastructure of the United States to crumble into, in many places, that of a third world country in order to support the military industrial expansion of a new American century. And that's exactly the wrong approach. Like if you look at the difference with, like Canada's like, they have their domestic foreign policy balance more or less figured out as far as I can tell, and that's why it's such an alluring place for most of us in the United States, like looking at it, slobbering over it, like how do we get in there? They're like, you're not getting in because we that if you did, we couldn't take care of our own, and so anyway, I mean, I've got to be careful with my sort of political musings, but I think
it just makes me think that the power, like that over the emphasis placed on military power at the expense of everything else is actually done more against, it's worked against the United States. I think the true power of the United States is not in its weapons, but it's in its people and the culture that it exports, like the music, the television shows, the documentaries, everything, all the culture that it exports, I think has had a far greater has had a far greater influence in shaping the rest of the world than I don't know, big guns. And I say this
again, if you sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I say this as I've lived in Asia for most of my life, and I watched a lot of American television, and I know that people in Europe, everyone who learns English kind of learns it through American television and listens to mainly American music. Things become more globalized, I guess, but over the past 50 years, I'd say a lot of the cultural exports of the United States is what has really helped cement it as like the global power. The
and I would say, like, beyond sort of the question of like whether cultural dominance is really soft power, like the CIA promoting modern art back in the 60s and 70s, is really like, I think more what I'm getting at is while all of that is true, I want to draw the contrast to like the approach of military dominance or soft power dominance is an emphasis on sort of
top-down control,
a hollow sense of control-based power, which is contraindicated in a world of complex dynamical systems, right? Like the whole point is you cannot know the whole system because you don't have the resources, computational or metabolic, to create a one-to-one map of reality. This is why there's a butterfly effect, right? Because there's always some pixel that it's like you have coarse-grained the world meteorological systems and missed something going on below the threshold of your ability to measure, and so like all of this stuff erupts out of the micro or the macro, erupts from beyond your liminal thresholds. And so like this is why, again, like I wrote a piece called "The Future is Indistinguishable from Magic" for that book, and in that book, talking about historically, masculine magical traditions emphasize control and power, and that's why you get stories like Faust or The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where it blows up in your face, where it's like you missed some key detail in your magical working, and now you have to suffer the tragic consequences of your own ignorance, whereas feminine magical traditions historically, on average, are about the alignment of the inner world with the cycles of the outer world. This is, again, like, if you look at like a Taoist way of knowing, this is about, it's like, I don't think it's quite accurate to call it going with the flow. I mean, it's kind of like hippie connotations that I don't think are like rigorous enough for what I'm describing here. But I'm talking about like what you called for a couple minutes ago was what I understand as cosmic humanism. What William Irwin Thompson talked about is a revival of a true cosmopolitanism, meaning living in the city but anchored in the cosmos. The way that ancient civilizations were all obsessed with their architecture being a reflection of their cosmology. And like if you look at the modern world, it's still a reflection of our cosmology, only it's unwitting. it's unintentional. You know, the fact is that the tallest building in the city used to be the church, and now it's the bank. And like, we don't think of ourselves as religious, but we're worshiping mammon. You know, we're worshiping this like self-consuming, uh, you know, anti-human, anti-life process that is intentionally blind to itself and intentionally blinds its constituents. And it's like that's not what we need right now. What we need is to wake up to the actual momenta and forces of history and where they are taking us, and accept them in some important way, and ally ourselves to the bigger picture, rather than persist in this foolish attempt to conquer nature, to dominate the natural world. And I mean, this is like, I have a Jurassic Park tattoo, like this is my Ian Malcolm rant here, that like, if you are doomed to fail, this is not about like, don't play God in like the simple way. That's like a vast oversimplification. It's that, you need to have some humility about the mystery of the world that we actually live in. And that's the only place that you can actually start to, to draw from, again, in that R.J. Stewart sense, the power of Merlin does not come from Merlin. It comes from the land. And he is an epiphenomenon of the agency of his own landscape, as all of us are. That was like the whole point of that, that piece on expertise, is that like, we are sort of nothing out of context. As William Irwin Thompson says, a fact requires a worldview the way that a flame requires an atmosphere. So like all identity and all purpose is bound in this way. And if you think that the goal is to exert your will upon the world, then the joke is on you, because you are a pawn for forces that you're not even aware of. You are a puppet for things that you are willfully not paying attention to. And that's where we are right now as a country, and as a sort of, Western civilization, broadly speaking. Who in their right mind thought it was a good idea to trawl the Great Barrier Reef? Like, are you out of your goddamn mind? Good luck. Good luck undermining everything upon which you depend. Like, we need to reverse this as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And rant.
Definitely. I think the talk of our cognitive biases and how they shape our lives at the beginning kind of fits in with this conversation, that we are pawns, moved by forces which we do not understand, and our biases kind of make this, apparent in some way. Like the fact that life goes back 4 billion years, and we are just, one extension of this branch. It makes me think, like, I'm studying philosophy at the moment, and like, I'm just completely obsessed with this notion of information, and how information like is everything. It is like what is the most important. It is like foundational to our ethic. It is foundational to what is good, or what we deem to be good. Like, I think there is some universal notion of I think information and ordered complexity and everything moving in this direction that we're observing. I think that's where the answer of what is good lies. And I don't know what that means for us. Like, if that's the case, I still don't know what that actually means for how we should act, except that we should be conserving. We should be conserving life. We should be tending to this garden, but rather than trying to shape it, we should just kind of bear witness to what it produces and celebrate in that fact. And that's it. That's
Definitely.
it. That because I don't see what else we can do, because we're just so fallible and I'm not going to say closed, but just so limited.
Yeah, well, there's two things that brings up for me. One is the talk that kind of most mind blowing thing that ever happened to me. My buddy Andrew Despy saw me speaking at Rainbow Serpent Festival in Australia, and he at the time worked for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and was able to invite me in to speak in their
You spoke
innovation
at the
lab.
Commonwealth Bank. Oh,
I
good.
did in Sydney, yeah, like downtown, and I gave what was scheduled to be like I think like a 40,
I
30
just
or
want
40
to
minute
bring some
talk.
context to
Yeah,
some people here listening. Like Commonwealth Bank, there are people like it's one of the big four banks in Australia, and there are a lot of people trying to petition people to get their money out of the Commonwealth Bank because they are, funding fossil fuels, and like their money is not aligned with our long-term interests. So I just think that that's just it's so brilliant to get the idea of you being implanted in there to to talk about these things just is hilarious.
it was funny because I think I was scheduled for half an hour, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I ended up keeping like half the audience there for 2 hours after 5 p.m. And then we went across the street and like had a couple pictures, and like I some of those people I was still hanging out with at midnight. It was a nod to Andrew Despy, who no longer works at the Commonwealth Bank, but nonetheless I think demonstrated what I would consider a powerful act of
Rebellion in a way.
social wizardry by even getting me in there. And the talk, which you can find the first part of the talk online on my YouTube channel, was called Tech Ethics as Psychedelic Parenting. And I was basically saying what you just said, which is that our technologies are not just going to do what we expect them to do. That there are always unintended consequences, and that it makes sense for us to think about these profound world shaping technologies that are being born through us right now as children, and to treat them with an understanding of what it is to raise a child. I mean, I was not yet a father at the time that I gave this talk, but I've been thinking in this way for years. I gave a sort of a more fleshed out and robust version of this talk at Burning Man, which you can find on Future Fossils. But this idea that like, a child, yeah, you can teach a child, you can raise a child well, but you cannot determine what that child will become. And this is a big piece of, if you look at Lewis Hyde's book, Common as Error, it's a fantastic piece on the history of intellectual property law, and how the patent was originally invented as sort of like that warm, shallow pond. It wasn't a way to control an idea. It was a way to nurture and incubate an idea before releasing it into the wild and into the commons, which like most people have forgotten about. Like this idea that like the things that we create are actually for other people and not just for our own personal gain. So like that's one thing. I agree with you that like the right way to think about this is more like, especially as technologies that we have created. Danny Hillis has a great piece on this called "The Age of Enlightenment is Over." Like the welcome to the age of entanglement. It's up on the MIT website. And Danny Hillis, who's a major figure, co-founder of the Long Now Foundation, was writing about how like new technologies, we're not even really inventing them. We're just sort of like growing them out of evolutionary algorithms, that like they're being as much designed by computers as they are by human beings. And so we're just sort of like specifying, oh, I want a bike that can hold up under these sort of pressures and constraints. And then what comes out looks more like a living creature than anything a human would have designed. This is true of like the computer architectures themselves now. And so more and more of this is about, emergent engineering, which is a big area of study at SFI also.
Yeah.
And so again, like to your point, we're talking about a garden here. We're talking about like
Or Gaia, right?
sculpting. Yeah,
Like
we're talking about like moving it in sort of, I guess the last thing to say about this, because I think this is really key as far as like anchoring this at the human level, is that there's another fantastic book I read called More Than Two, which is a handbook for polyamorous relationships. And they talk about this garden metaphor in terms of, the human love life. Basically, like you don't control who you're going to meet. You have no control over who you're going to fall in love with. You only kind of have control over what plants you decide to rip up after the seeds blow into your garden. And like maybe the right thing to do is to like wait and see what's growing before you rip it up, or before you, like that there's that, if every some of these relationships are going to feed on one another, and some of them are going to nourish each other. And you don't really know until you just sort of allow those things to take their course, and to treat it not as a sort of Italian garden, historically, like these great gardens of the of the Enlightenment, where everything is so perfectly manicured, but like wild crafting, like the indigenous peoples of Australia did for like 40,000 years or whatever, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas did, so that when the colonists came to these places, it looked wild to them. It looked like nobody was doing anything, when in fact it was people were taking very, very careful care. We're encouraging biodiversity and what we would call anti-fragility, Nassim Taleb's idea of like something that actually can take a hit and get stronger for it, and that's where we need to be right now, is wild crafting our technologies, our regulation, our personal relationships, and that means a good deal of surrender, for which our education in the modern world has not prepared us.
Is that what you mean by rewilding the future? Is it because that's a term that,
Yes.
yeah, okay, because I was going to ask you about that, because I wasn't quite sure. I had like an intuitive understanding of what that might mean, but that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, rewilding is like a whole cultural movement about just sort of releasing spaces and like I guess one really cool example that I learned about from Kat Harrison, an ethnobotanist, back in 2010, was this idea of daylighting. And daylighting is when, in the course of a city, the construction of a city, the natural waterways that flow through that city have been paved over and forced underground. Like, all of these creeks upon which New York was built still exist. They're just in the sewers, And what that does is it kills the delicate ecosystems that were supporting that whole area. And so there's been a movement in architecture over the last couple decades to restore those waterways to a natural balance, like restoring them to the atmosphere and to sunlight, and allowing rather than just like putrid chemicals collecting in them underground, allowing the sort of natural photosynthesis and bacterial and microbial and microfaunal balance to reassert itself. And like something like that has to be going on for the human imagination right now also, that we have paved over what it means to be human over the last few hundred years, and it's time to I think this is again one of these things that we may not actually have to force. I think it's a mistake of a lot of people in the so-called visionary or culture that we're gonna, like, if you look back in the 60s and the way that like psychedelics were sort of zealously forced upon so many people, like actually like literally like CIA putting LSD in the drinking water, Tim Leary saying everyone should take acid. We don't need to push the river, quote unquote, and a lot of us are sweeping the tide, as it were. And I think that really what this is not about so much forcing historical change. We're living through more than our share of it. It's about learning how to integrate those changes. And so it's like, I don't think that we actually need to, break the concrete of, the modern psyche so much as we need to know where to put it when the forces of history that we're living through now break it for us. That like those days are over. And it's just a matter of making sure that we pass through this age of metamorphosis as carefully as possible, and with
That we
the
survive first and foremost, and then
right,
we're as
minimal
careful.
damage. Yeah, like let's how many buildings need to come down for this revolution to succeed? Hopefully not that many, right? Hopefully the systems, it's just this question of like how much destruction has to happen for this rebirth to occur. And like I don't think we need to force it. Like there's plenty of people out there that are doing the work for us, and plenty of transcendent natural processes over which we have no control, that are dragging us kicking and screaming into the next age. But hopefully we stop kicking and screaming and can like learn
Move
to
with it
enjoy the
rather
view.
than, yeah. And maybe harness some of the direction, if we're being pushed in one direction, maybe rather than fight against it, we can kind of work with it and influence it a little bit, like
Yeah.
navigate briefly, just as much as we can on these turbulent oceans.
Or at least harness the friction of us being dragged into like spinning a turbine or something,
Yeah.
like close all material and energetic loops wherever possible. That's the circular thinking of the new integrated West, I think.
Yeah.
Is like a return to that, like again a return to that kind of cyclical medicine wheel kind of idea of there's no such thing as waste. Bill Thompson talked about this, that the emergence of the chaotic dynamical world age came after World War II, when we realized that you can't just nuclear bomb your enemy into submission without drinking that fallout the next year, that there is no other, in a really like fundamental way, that it's like everything we do is downstream. Like we are downstream of all of our own actions eventually. And like when I
That's
spoke
karma,
to,
right? Like this is
yeah,
like the science of karma in a way.
it is like when I spoke to Mark Nelson for Future Fossils podcast. Mark lives here in Santa Fe. He's a really interesting guy. He wrote a book called The Wastewater Gardener, based on work that he did inside Biosphere 2, which was this completely balls out visionary experiment to reproduce 5 major Earth ecosystems inside a single building in Arizona back in the 1990s. There's a new documentary about it called Spaceship Earth. I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone to realize the kind of like innovative, visionary cultural efforts that we're standing upon in this conversation. And Mark said, that the atmosphere of this building was so small that it made certain things that were hard to see at the global scale incredibly obvious at the scale of like trying to simulate a planet inside a building. And like, for example, the atmospheric regulation of this place was such that you could see the gas levels, you could see like the pollution meter start to go up after just a few hours if you accidentally cross-threaded the cap of a bottle of glue. Like it would get picked up by the sensitive readers that they were using to monitor the internal atmosphere of this place. And like Rusty Schweikart, who was a member of the Lindisfarne Association and an astronaut, U.S. astronaut, talked about this also. Talked about the way that space stations, these closed, autonomous systems, reveal to us the damage that we're actually doing in a way that's not obvious. The greenhouse effect was like plain as day in Biosphere 2. They were suffering immensely because they were producing too much carbon dioxide, and it nearly suffocated all 8 people living in the building. It's like a really interesting part of the sort of peril of that adventure narrative. But like that was 1993, and like a ton of people still don't get it because this atmosphere is enormous, and it's like you're not necessarily going to suffocate in your own house. Like you're not going to choke on your own exhaust yet, but like if you live in, I don't know, Beijing, it's considerably more obvious. Yeah. So at any rate, it's just like you said, it's like a science of karma. It's understanding that at some time scale, even if you don't live to see it, your kids will, or their kids will. And so we need to think about all of these things in a profoundly different way from the way that we have been thinking about them. Yeah.
Yeah, our time is running short, and perhaps this might not be the best time to have this conversation, but I think given recent events on the things that have become, you could say, more public, with the Washington Post and all that, what I'm talking about is, of course, UFOs and, these and extraterrestrials and all that. Because I'd love to dive in there with you, because I just in my most recent podcasts, I've had like a little experience, but it was just like floating orbs in the sky that were moving in formation, and they rearranged while moving at uniform speed, and they kind of disappeared. That's the extent of my
Where and when did you see that?
20 end of 2011. It was the day after the Geminid meteor shower. And the reason why I remember this is because I was on the roof and I saw like 11 shooting stars. And I'm like unbundling these guys up into one, and I'm making a wish, because that's what, like there's no rules for these things. And I wished to contact or come to contact with aliens. Like that was my one wish. And the next night I saw this formation of floating orbs traveling across the night sky, and I was completely sober. And I've just heard you mention these things in your podcasts or in some of your episodes, and like this is like public knowledge now. Like we have these things that are flying that we don't really know what the fuck they are, how to explain them. And the Navy pilot's like, shit, man, like I've never seen anything like that. And then everyone's like, we told you so. We've been saying this for a century. So talk to me. What
well,
have you?
I will, I think, pass the ball on this one to my friend Stewart Davis, who is one of the major inspirations to me as a songwriter over the years, and a sort of transdisciplinary creative fireball. Comedian, filmmaker, painter, somebody that I feel very much sort of as an elder brother along my own path up the mountain. And Stewart just started a podcast called Aliens and Artists, where he's interviewing all these artists from around the world about their UFO or extraterrestrial contact experiences. And I was just interviewed for this show. My interview should be out in a couple weeks.
Oh, perfect.
Depending on when you release this, as well as the new single that I was just telling you about at the beginning of the call, which was inspired by a couple of my songs were inspired by these UFO sightings that I've had over the years. And so I'll be debuting that on his show. But like, you listen to this, to me it seems very clear that they, like, each one of these cases taken individually presents a kind of axiom in a larger proof, that like alone my experiences aren't going to necessarily prove anyone. You have to like constellate everything that everyone is reporting to realize that we have like clearly crossed the Rubicon of statistical deniability. And that, certain things like this woman, Kate Torvald, that Stewart had on his show recently, has 35 implants that are like magnetic implants that she can like put a magnet on, has no idea where they came from, seem to be like operating on her body in weird ways.
She didn't put them in there.
No.
Oh, I thought she was just some transhumanist who likes to feel.
No, she woke up with these things inside of her body with no seams, no surgical scars of any kind, and swears up and down that they are like streaming visual information into her consciousness. Like she's writing a book. She's an artist. She's writing a book about physics and cosmology that she says the implants are telling her how to write.
I'll read that.
Like, so it's like, and that's just one person. There are like, when you actually dive into the literature, there's countless people. So like I recently had another friend of mine and Stewart's, my former graduate advisor, Sean S. Bjorn Hargens,
I listened to
on
that,
Future Fossils.
Kind of what
so he's put together, the sort of rudimentary gesture towards a unifying meta theory for this phenomena, which he's somebody who taught me at the adult level how to like move, how to juggle multiple perspectives. And his work is really profound and powerful, I think, because he's making an effort to integrate 150 different philosophical disciplines, from feminist critical discourse to indigenous thinking to Western philosophy and the philosophy of science, and he's bringing it all together in a way that posits a radically different structure for epistemology and ontology in our world, where like things can pass in and out of, what we think of as like the real, like where like reality, can become more or less real, can be infused and go from something that's purely subjective to something that's objective and back.
Yeah.
There's like
fascinating was saying that
yeah.
there's talk of Batman being real, and like from an information perspective, like I was just thinking about it, like Batman exists as configurations of matter in all of our minds as information there, and we can if Batman does something in the movie that Batman wouldn't do, people would know. Like Batman as an entity, as this informational entity, has a nature, has some form of identity that is continuing on beyond what the creator would have ever have imagined, right? Like the creator.
It's funny that you bring that up, because actually Zack Snyder's Batman in Batman versus Superman had like guns on his Batmobile, and people lost their minds over that. They were like, that's completely out of character. That's not like machine guns. For Batman is like rabidly anti-gun. And of course, like there have been previous Batmobiles with guns, but they weren't like quite as like prominent, I guess. But you're right that like this thing has an agency,
life of its own. Yeah,
a life of its own.
Yeah.
And so, that this gets into, Sean attaches the UFO phenomenon to, the literature of the weird, things such as like the tulpas out of Tibetan Buddhism, which are like thought forms that gain a life of their own. Like anybody who's watched the show Twin Peaks, knows that there's like, you can sort of invoke a discarnate entity that then sort of has its own ideas. And I talk about sort of some of my experiences with that in that episode of Future Fossils with Sean. And at any rate, I think that folks who want to get into a deeper inquiry with this question ought to listen to that, and then ought to listen to Stewart's Aliens and Artists podcast, because it's just chock full of extraordinary stories, starting with his own, where he had a profound series of bizarre, inexplicable experiences involving sort of mantis aliens over the last 10 years that, guided him into not only, organizing this extraordinary group of people to make a film that was sort of like delivered to him by the mantis aliens, but also inspired him to like do enough research into this kind of phenomenon to inquire into why it is that the people who have these experiences end up being so profoundly inspired and take on these life-changing creative projects out of their encounters with them. That it's like it moves you the way that a religious experience moves you to create. And like, what is that? And like, what is going on behind the scenes? Like, how is my individual creative act that was inspired by a UFO encounter part of some sort of larger symphonic movement in the historical and evolutionary forces, or like stories of our species and our planet? Like, when you put all of these pieces together, what shape does it make? That like all of these people are sort of instruments that are being played by what appear to be aliens to us. I mean, it's a very, very strange and curious question. And if you shrink from that investigation because it's too weird, like I have sympathy for that. It's like you can't just like stare into the abyss all day every day without eclipse glasses, which I highly recommend. Learn proper shielding, as my friends JF Martel and Phil Ford say on Weird Studies podcast, which I adore, and I've been on their show and they've been on mine. But they talk about, if you're gonna take up magic, you need to learn how to banish the things that you've created. Like you need to learn how to reassert the circle of protection around yourself, and like be a human again, rather than just like the flute for whatever.
And just like a more real example would be just if you're Jim Carrey and you're like, or if you're a method actor, like find out a way to go back to normal, right?
Don't be Heath Ledger. Don't let the Joker just kill you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think actually Robert Pattinson's kind of going through a similar thing now with, as taking up the mantle of the Batman, and now he has coronavirus.
He's just talking like
and
this
it's like,
all the time.
Yeah, it's like, like
Around
you got to be
that.
careful. You got to be like, it's a great example actually, because you know, the Joker, uh, in some way killed Heath Ledger, and like this extremely dark vision of the Batman that's being filmed right now, is threatening the life of Robert Pattinson, and it's like, you've, my friends, like, please, um, remember that it's sort of like the same question with, you know the human institutional relationship.
Well, it's all about the
It's like,
power of ideas. It's the power of
yeah,
ideas. Like that's what it
don't,
really
yeah,
is.
when like Daniel Pinchbeck, I remember in Breaking Open the Head, talked about, um, you know, being, who are you feeding with your thoughts? With what you believe is sort of its own entity. An idea has a life of its own, and it lives in the brains, minds, and behavior of all of the people who entertain it. And so, like, there's a very real sense in which, um, you know, money is a god, that controls the lives of its adherents. And yet I guess all of us are sort of like a server that's like giving partial computational resources to like all of these like this pantheon of different stuff. And
And
so it's
some of
just, you
them
got,
help us. So, like there's this
right,
symbiotic relationship. It's not all negative. Like the
right,
notions of individual freedom, for instance, have done a lot of good for us. But at the same time, like we are still in service to them. Like they are in our minds. They cause us to act in certain ways, and hopefully reproduce. Seed in the minds of others. The problem is not all ideas are equal, and not all bear wonderful fruit that will nourish the future. Others just poison.
totally. So this is where I think, like, whether you talk about it as like a memome, or an, I like, the
Memo.
ideobiome. So
Oh
you get
yeah,
like a
gotcha. Yeah,
microbiome,
gotcha. Yeah.
right? Like all of the little bacteria that live in you. But you also have an idiobiome, which is like all of the ideas, all the thoughts you have. And so there's another great bumper sticker I love, that says, "Don't believe everything you think." It's like you got to be willing to, well, like, don't take antibiotics and kill every thought you have, like some radical, spiritual practitioners who are like anti-ego and anti-thinking. Like, I don't know that that's healthy, ultimately. But like, you got to get some distance from
Mhm.
that. You got to be the unattachment, the willingness to, flush your system and take a new course of probiotics is like identical in some sense to the willingness to change your mind when you're confronted with evidence that requires you to do so. And so, that's threatening to the self that wants to narrativize continuity over the course of one's entire life. It's threatening to the, like, in the same way that evolution. There's a great piece I have pinned to the top of my Twitter profile right now about the way that science fiction has handled the epistemic, challenges presented by the theory of evolution. The people are like, my grandfather wasn't a monkey. And it's like the fact that things change, the fact that human beings are not a fixed ontological category was and continues to be for many people a very, very challenging and difficult idea that they're unwilling to accept. Their mental immune system is rejecting it, you know? So, and I just think, it's wise to, one, acknowledge that you have an immune system, two, that it doesn't, it's not keeping everything out. That like all of us are sort of, in some sense or another, host to all kinds of, intellectual parasites.
That's culture.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that you can change, and that you can go through a detox, and take, you know again, it's like the garden. Like, you don't want to just like raise your entire yard. You might want to do a little weeding, or maybe, you should consider the fact that the weeds growing there are like medicinal in
Yeah,
some
like the
way.
best weed in the world.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you're not, yeah, if that's the elephant in the room of this conversation, probably. When I talk, my buddy Chris Katana is always going like, but it's like, oh, come on, man, like this shit does not make sense. But at any rate, dude, yeah, this has been super fun.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
really
no.
glad that we finally lined this up.
Yeah, me too. Where can people people find you online? Any parting messages? Like, yeah, just
Um,
whatever you want
yeah,
to
I mean,
whatever you want
I'm
to
at
share.
Michael Garfield on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not terribly active on Instagram, except I share a lot of really interesting things in the stories there, but things my friends are doing. Twitter is more like where act like smart ass. Um, I'm on. I'm the real Michael Garfield at Facebook. Uh, if you want to follow my personal profile there, I have a Patreon account, patreon.com/Michael Garfield, where I post all of my work before I'm ready to just like piss it into the wind of social media. And Future Fossils podcast is my own show. Complexity podcast is the show I run for the Santa Fe Institute. That's a little bit more sober, daylight science conversations, and I'm
Still
less.
awesome. Huge
It
fan.
is. I love it. I love it. But we're not going to really get into like we're not going to seriously entertain the idea of aliens or talk about psychedelics on that show. But it's really, really good if you want to understand um, how the world's like elite systems researchers are thinking about things and like what they're discovering. But I would say, yeah, just hit me up on Patreon, and I have like a cornucopia of free stuff up there, including a coloring book and like hours and hours of
Yes, it's
music.
awesome. It's awesome.
So yeah, and obviously, if people want to reach out to me, I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. So please
Yeah,
do. I would
yeah,
love to hear from you.
awesome. Well, Michael, thank you very much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sam.